Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. History in the making. Crimea's return to Russia is at the center of an East-West standoff not seen since the Cold War. Sanctions are being met with sanctions. For how long will the West back the illegal government in Kiev and deny the people of Crimea self-determination? To CrossTalk Crimea, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. In Berlin, we have Manuel Ochsenreiter. He is a journalist, editor, and reporter. And here in Moscow, we cross to Mark Sleboda. He is a senior lecturer and researcher at Moscow State University. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Marcus in London, if I can go to you first. A very historic day, I would say, and a very interesting speech. Your thoughts?
I absolutely agree with that. I think President Putin's speech might as well have been a speech to the whole world, because the contents of his speech epitomised and encapsulated the views and concerns of millions of people the world over about how America in the last 20 years has been conducting its foreign policy, how it has aggressively and recklessly been pursuing its own national self-interest in different regions around the world, from Yugoslavia to Iraq to Libya to Syria. And I think that President Putin made it very clear that this is 2014. This is not the 1990s. This is not the 1990s when Russia was on its knees. Russia was weak and America kicked Russia in the teeth to achieve global dominance. This is 2014, and Russia will be firmly in the international arena and will be pursuing its national interests as any self-dignified country has the right to do.
Okay. Manuel, and if I can cross to you to Berlin, you were in Crimea during the referendum, the vote. Please tell me your personal experience. What did you see?
It was a wonderful experience for me as a journalist, but also for me especially as a German, because the experience, the mood I witnessed on Crimea in these days I was there is similar to the mood and to the emotions the Germans used to have in 1989. I think this parallel we can draw. This is what I witnessed. I saw everywhere happy people. I saw people can't wait to become again a part of Russia. They told me, we want to come home. It was a coming home for them. So it was a wonderful experience. By the way, I spoke also with a lot of other people you wouldn't expect that they would love to come home. For example, we have in the West, in the mainstream media, they tell us always that the Crim Tatar population is strongly against Russia. My interviews and my conversations I had with them show me that's not true. There are some of them, and of course those functionaries who are strongly supported by the European Union as well as from the United States or from the West in general.
Manuel, let me ask you a quick question here. Manuel, I want to ask you a question because I think it's really important. Did you see, because what you see here in Western media, that this was a referendum under a gun? Would you agree or disagree with that? Was there coercion? Was there coercion?
I'm sorry, this is a complete joke to claim this. And I mean, if anybody claims that this was a referendum under the gun who wasn't there, I can excuse that he claims this because he wasn't there. But if somebody claims this who was there on Crimea, I can just say this person is a complete liar. There is nothing to say more about this. There was no gun. The people were free to vote. And by the way, I was talking yesterday in the evening when, or 2 days ago in the evening when the referendum was done with observers from Austria. I knew we were discussing all this, and they confirmed as well that this was a very normal election, and they felt reminded to the normal city elections in any Austrian city. So this was an extreme civilian, normal, civilized election. The people were happy, by the way. I was in different voting points. The people were coming with their whole families, and they celebrated. It was
on that very important point, I want to go to Mark here in Moscow, because I know your wife was in Crimea. Please tell our viewers what she saw and what she experienced.
Yeah, my wife is originally from the Crimea, from Simferopol. And like many expats from the Crimea, she returned home in order to vote with her family and to vote resoundingly for reunification with the Russian Federation. And they were absolutely ecstatic. They were popping champagne bottles in the streets. underneath fireworks. And the words of my mother-in-law in particular was, "I never dreamed that I would live long enough to see this happen." So it is very much a returning home for the Crimean people. But it should be said that this returning home only happens in the context of the events of the last month or so, the last few months in Kiev and in the west of the country. Because while Crimeans felt themselves to be Russians, they have been more or less content to be part of the Ukraine for the last 20 years. There have been Russian separatist movements before, but they were always held at bay by the Russian Federation itself. However, this putsch regime that has come into power, consisting of ultranationalists and open fascists who have created a cult of worship and national identity around the genocidal Nazi collaborator Stefan Bandera, and the raft of legislation and the pogroms and nighttime raids by these right sector militants that have occurred throughout the country since then have forced the Crimean people to suddenly rediscover their Russian identity and to turn to Russia for safety. And I have to disagree. In one sense, this referendum was held under the gun because it never could have happened if the Crimean people and those Russian-related forces that assisted them hadn't secured the peninsula and allowed this referendum to take place. If this had not happened, much like we have seen in the streets of Kharkov, Donetsk, and Lugansk, right sector militants would be making nightly raids, seizing government buildings, beating people on the street, threatening politicians to resign as they walk into council chambers with hammers, taking up position behind them, beating up politicians, kidnapping them and making them decant their positions on the air. And we know all of this only because these people are sick enough to record their actions themselves with complete impunity. And that means that it's only the tip of the iceberg, because that's all that we've been able to see.
You know, Marcus in London, I think it's very interesting. We'll talk about sanctions in the second half of the program. But it's interesting to me the people of Crimea feel safe now because they're away from these fanatics in Kiev. But you know, the West has them now. It's their prodigy. They're going to have to take care of it. Finally, the news will have to focus back to Kiev. And the West wants to avoid that at all cost.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about the West placing sanctions, and of course some sanctions were announced this week, and there could be some to follow now because the Crimea will become part of Russia. But I think we do need to bear in mind that we live in the era of globalization. All governments, all business communities are all interconnected today. So it's if America places a sanction, a serious sanction on Russia, it probably will have an impact on Russia, but it's also going to have an impact on America. But I don't think we should become hysterical about economic sanctions. Let's not forget that the West never recognized the Baltic states as being a part of the Soviet Union.
True.
Yet the West, throughout the Cold War, traded with the Soviet Union. So I think that there will be sanctions to follow, but how long-term will they be? And certainly if Britain was to place some sort of serious sanctions on Russia, the British business people, the British business community will be going into number 10 Downing Street, and they'll be saying, Prime Minister Cameron, you are going to be jeopardising Britain's economic recovery by jeopardising Britain's trade with Russia. So it's certainly, it's not clear cut. And I would add this as well, that, you know, taking lectures from the West on the need to respect international law, it's like taking a lecture from a serial killer on the need to protect human life. It's absolutely ludicrous, it is. All you need to take is Yugoslavia, is Iraq, is Libya, and what the Americans are doing at the moment in Syria, supporting Islamist militants who are fighting against a legitimate government in Syria. So these war of words from the West, they don't hold, and their audacity is absolutely remarkable.
Manuel, in Berlin, I liked what you had to say about the reunification of Germany, because it gets down to self-determination. Why should the people of Crimea be denied that when we in the West support it, at least officially, or I guess only when we want to?
This is absolutely the question we should ask right now Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, as well as Joachim Gauck, the German President. Because, I mean, we should know both condemn the referendum and the separation of Crimea or the reunification of Crimea with the Russian Federation, but both benefit from the German reunification. Angela Merkel as well as Joachim Gauck are from East Germany. They are not West Germans, so they are personally benefiting from that what happened and what they experienced themselves for their own people, for their own nation, for the German nation. They don't want to give the others, but this shows us something else. It shows us that the German government, as well as many other European governments, by the way, don't act on their behalf when it comes on foreign politics. They act on the geopolitical behalf of the West, of the NATO, of Washington, of Brussels. Brussels is nothing else than a chapter, a NATO chapter, if we want to say it like this, a transatlanticist chapter. So Germany, as well as the other European countries, are acting on that behalf and not outspoken, not on the behalf of their own national or of the European interest.
Okay, Mark, let me go to Mark and Moscow here right before we go to the break here. Mark, I ask all Russians I know if they like the idea of what's happened today, and they almost all say yes, in the 90 percentile. What's your experience?
Yes, I think the opinion polls that were conducted showed that I think it was something like 96% of Russians approve of what's going on, which leaves the 4% continual liberal fifth column as the dissenters. The scenes in Russia have been, in the Crimea, have been completely echoed by the streets in Russia, where Russians have staged demonstrations that should be described more as celebrations.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after our short break, we'll continue our discussion on Crimea. Stay with RT.
I love
My name's Daniel Bush.
Tom Urban in Washington, D.C.
Banking new policies.
Considered I'm Peter Lavelle.
A pleasure to have you with us here on RT today. I'm Rory Susham.
We wanted to create a realistic model that would represent life, that would depict life as it really is.
There's an accident on Route 6.
What can be more wonderful than this? The whole thing is a marvel.
Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Crimea's return to Russia. Okay, I'd like to go back to Marcus in London. Let's go back to Putin's speech today. He certainly gave a lecture to the United States and its allies about history, particularly the history of the last 20 years. Is this a line being drawn in the sand here? Is Russia saying, enough is enough, and we can push back?
No doubt about it. President Putin made it very clear that from the day the Soviet Union collapsed, America and its allies took advantage of that. They sidelined Russia in the international arena, and they did, without any doubt, achieve American political dominance in the world. There's no question about that. I mean, you know, people like to point out what happened with Iraq, but you really have to take it back to the former Yugoslavia. It all happened in the former Yugoslavia. That's when NATO started to flex its muscles. There was nothing Russia could do about it. It started in Bosnia. It then carried on into Kosovo. We then had Iraq, and then we even had Libya a few years ago. And I would also say that although today really does mark the beginning, perhaps, of a new world order, I would also say don't forget about Syria, because the only reason why there wasn't an American attack against Syria last year was because of Russia's strength. If the fighting in Syria today had happened in the 1990s, the Americans would have attacked Syria and the Syrian government would have been deposed. So yes, today I believe is a turning point, but we mustn't forget Syria. And President Putin will keep on pursuing Russia's foreign policy objectives around the world, as Russia has every single right to do. The West doesn't like that, because the West for the last 20 years has enjoyed complete dominance in the world, and it will raise every single challenge. It will try and put every single obstacle in front of Russia to try and cripple it, like how Russia's been suspended from the G8. And, you know, I think that's ridiculous. And it just shows that Russia was never a genuine member of the G8. And I think Russia does need to start looking to forging even closer relations with China, India, Vietnam, and with Latin America too.
Mark, here in Moscow, it was interesting what Marcus said, is that the West doesn't like this, the West doesn't like that. Well, the Russian people and Vladimir Putin don't really care what the West likes and doesn't like. Is this a new Cold War, or are we getting into a new world order, as Marcus said?
Yes, I think very much so. And one thing that should be noted, that actually the events that we have seen in the Crimea can be directly related back as well to the events in 2008, when a U.S.-backed neoliberal, neoconservative Saakashvili regime in Georgia attempted by force to annex South Ossetia, and in the process killing UN-approved Russian peacekeepers, which caused Russia to react back, restoring the provinces and the breakaway provinces, and then recognizing them as independent states. That is the first indication, and quite clearly Russia's red lines were crossed at the time, and the West didn't learn its lessons. And once again, they went into the Ukraine attempting once again to flip the government, as they did earlier with the Orange Revolution, this time with the addition of several thousand ultra-nationalist paramilitary and politicians, making it an even more odious event. So we have seen the formulation of a new world order. Putin, in his speech today, personally thanked China and India for their constructive stances on this, with China abstaining in the Security Council and India making statements recognizing Russia's legitimate interest in the Crimea. We have seen a clear indication that Russia has had it up to here with the West, that they are entire focus of Russian economic and foreign policy would now be directed towards Asia, Russia's own Asian pivot, and the West has only themselves to thank for this. They have ensured the Sino-Russian condominium by attempting to emasculate Russia in the Ukraine.
Manuel, as a European, as a German, are you willing to take care of the rest of Ukraine and that government that is there? How do you feel about that? Are you going to pay for it?
Peter, I would be so happy if my government would ask me that in a form of referendum, like on Crimea. So a question like that. Because of, I was always saying on Crimea, I'm never asked in a referendum about a really decisive change of the politics of my country. But indeed, what you say is the absolute truth. They say now Europe has to take care. The European Union will have to take care about Western Ukraine. And the European Union, let's talk really frankly with each other, Peter. The European Union, this is, in that sense, it's Germany. It's the German economy with the backbone, the spine of the European economy. And when it comes to paying for this and paying for that, or bailing out this or that country, it always comes to the German taxpayer. And of course, the German taxpayer will be not asked We will receive now a lot of lies. We will hear many lies in our mainstream media and from our politicians why it is so important to rescue, I say this in attention marks, Ukraine, maybe from the Russian aggression or Russian pressure. But of course, it comes back to the German taxpayer to do that.
Okay, Marcus, how should the Europeans deal with it? Because we know what Ms. Nuland thinks about the European Union very well, but hasn't it really all backfired on the West, this whole attempt to regime change in Ukraine? Because they get the rump part of the state, okay? And it should also say something about self-determination within the European Union. If the Crimeans can do it, well, the Scots and others.
Well, I think the European Union undoubtedly will carry out at some point a post-mortem because they got it very, very wrong on Ukraine, and one has to question the competence of the so-called Russian experts in the British government, in the French government, and also in the German government. Did they honestly think that Russia would sit back and let a Western-backed coup succeed in Ukraine, a Western-backed coup full of truly repugnant people that hold ultra-nationalist views and neo-Nazi views, anti-Semitic views? So I would raise that about why the European Union honestly thought Russia wouldn't react. But the European Union is very, very seriously dependent on Russia for gas and for oil. And unlike for America, the European Union is next door to Russia. So it's in the European Union's interests to actually say to America, actually, we live next door to Russia. We have to have good relations with Russia. Whether the European Union or not does that, I don't know. I doubt it, because let's be clear, Brussels and Washington are joined at the hip. Whenever a country becomes a member of the European Union, not long after they become a member of NATO. So yes. I don't think the European Union, its past actions bode well for the future whatsoever.
Mark, here in Moscow, please address the issue of the Russian speakers in East and South Ukraine now, after these events with Crimea today. Are you worried?
Extremely much so. As with over the last 3 or 4 weeks, today we saw huge protests of Russian ethnics, Russian speakers, all those in the East and South Ukraine who draw their cultural identity and their political orientation towards Russia. They are demonstrating for referendums, calling for referendums that would allow them to repeat what the Crimea has just done to escape this insane putsch regime that has occupied Kiev, and raising the Russian flags over government buildings. In order to counter this putsch regime has installed a number of oligarchs as the rulers of fiefdoms over the East Ukraine to repress these protests and ensure this new order's dominion over East and South Ukraine. And along with that is the assumption that they will use out of their own pockets, hire thugs, paramilitaries, in order to keep the people down. And if this revolution was supposed to be about corruption and restoring human dignity to the Ukraine, that's absolutely laughable with what we have seen here. This is a completely corrupt and nationalistic government that intends to force its conception of Ukrainian identity and its foreign policy and economic alternative on the rest of the Ukraine by force, by whatever means are necessary.
Marcus, I'm thinking back to November with the well-known association agreement, the EU association agreement. Ukraine was in trouble, economic trouble, in recession, and now it's March, and the United States and the European Union have broken this country, literally broken it. What's your reaction to that? I mean, it wasn't great before, but it was certainly not this.
Well, they've brought this on themselves, they have. They have been pursuing geostrategic objectives in Ukraine, namely trying to tear Ukraine away from Russia and bring it into the EU and bring it into NATO. Because let's not forget, Ukraine was the missing jigsaw piece for the West, because if you look at the western borders of the Russian Federation, all the way from the Baltics down to Romania, it's littered with EU and NATO member states. That's what America's involvement in Ukraine has been about. It's got nothing to do with democracy or human rights. If the Americans were so committed to democracy and human rights, they wouldn't have such a close strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. And if people think that when President Putin says that Russia is that the West is trying to encircle Russia on its borders, if people think that's fantasy, well, there's historical precedents. You know, the Crimean War was fought by the British and the French to limit Russian influence in the Black Sea region, the Balkans. The Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 was signed to limit Russian influence in the Far East. During the Cold War, the Americans implemented the doctrine known as containment, containing Soviet Russia on a global scale. And in the last 20 years, Russia's western borders have been encroached upon by NATO and by the European Union. And on top of that, we now have an American missile defense shield being constructed on Russia's western borders, which, it has to be said, poses a very serious threat to Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent. That's what all this is about. Russia is not responsible for the crisis in Ukraine.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time. I wish we had
West.
more time. Congratulations to the people of Crimea. Many thanks to my guests in London, Berlin, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.